In 1763, France controlled an empire that stretched across 5 continents. Just 200 years later, its vast imperial possessions had vanished, reduced to a handful of tiny islands and distant territories. The rise and fall of the French Empire is one of history's most dramatic imperial collapses. From Jacques Cartier's first voyage in 1534 to the bloody Algerian War ending in 1962, we're about to discover how France built the world's second-largest colonial empire, controlling 8.6% of the world's land, only to lose it all in a series of catastrophic wars, revolutions, and resistance movements that would reshape the modern world. While Spain and Portugal dominated early European colonization, France was determined to claim its share of the New World's bounty. In April 1534, the first significant French expedition set sail when Jacques Cartier departed from St. Malo with 2 ships and approximately 60 sailors. King Francis I had commissioned this voyage with clear instructions: find gold, discover a passage to Asia, and extend France's influence across the Atlantic. Upon reaching the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Cartier encountered more than just new lands. At Gaspé Bay, he made contact with over 300 indigenous people from Stadacona, modern-day Quebec, initiating what would become a distinctive approach to Native American relations. Unlike their European rivals, who often arrived with overwhelming military force, the French frequently operated with smaller contingents, necessitating more diplomatic engagement with indigenous populations. This first meeting established a pattern that would characterize French colonial relationships for generations. When Cartier returned to France, he brought 2 sons of Chief Donnacona with him, not as captives in chains, but as honored guests who would learn French and serve as interpreters on future voyages. This practice of cultural exchange, while still deeply problematic by modern standards, contrasted sharply with the more immediately aggressive approaches of Spanish conquistadors. The following decades revealed that France's approach to empire building would differ fundamentally from its competitors. While Spanish colonization focused on extracting precious metals through conquest and forced labor, French interests in North America gradually centered on the fur trade. Beaver pelts, in particular, became extraordinarily valuable commodities in European markets, where they were fashioned into fashionable hats and garments for the elite. This economic foundation shaped France's entire colonial strategy. Rather than establishing large settler colonies requiring vast agricultural lands and the displacement of indigenous people, the French built trading networks that depended on native hunters and trappers. Independent French traders, known as coureurs de bois, ventured deep into the continent's interior, often adopting indigenous ways of life and forming alliances through marriage, which eventually gave rise to the distinct Métis culture. However, France's early colonial ambitions faced significant setbacks. A Huguenot attempt to establish Fort Caroline in Florida in 1562 ended disastrously when Spanish forces massacred nearly all the colonists, asserting Spain's claim to the region. More devastatingly, religious wars consumed France itself throughout the latter half of the 16th century, draining resources and attention that might otherwise have supported colonial expansion. Despite these challenges, French engagement with North America continued through seasonal settlements. Fishing fleets from Normandy and Brittany established temporary bases in Newfoundland to process their catches, while traders maintained small outposts along the St. Lawrence. These modest beginnings hardly suggested the vast empire France would eventually build, but they secured crucial footholds on the continent. Not until 1627, with the establishment of the Company of 100 Associates by Cardinal Richelieu, did France make its first serious attempt at organizing colonial efforts in New France. Even then, the company struggled financially from the start, highlighting the challenges of maintaining colonies across such vast distances. As the company of 100 associates faltered under financial strain, a more durable foundation for French colonial ambitions was taking shape far to the north. Unlike Spain's conquistadors who marched through jungles seeking cities of gold, French traders were pioneering a different path to empire, one built on relationships rather than conquest, where native knowledge became more valuable than European military might. France's colonial strategy underwent a fundamental shift at the turn of the 17th century. In 1600, Pierre Chauvin established a trading post at Tadoussac, at the confluence of the Saguenay and St. Lawrence rivers. This marked France's first attempt at year-round presence in North America. 8 years later, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, a settlement that would become the heart of New France. Champlain, now remembered as the father of New France, recognized that survival in this harsh environment required cooperation with indigenous peoples rather than subjugation. What emerged was a uniquely French approach to colonization. Rather than focusing on agricultural settlements populated by European farmers, New France developed around trading networks that stretched deep into the continent's interior. At the center of this economy was a single animal, the beaver. European fashion had created insatiable demand for beaver felt hats, making the pelts extraordinarily valuable. A single high-quality beaver pelt could fetch more than a month's wages for a French laborer. The genius of the French approach lay in its adaptation to North American realities. With limited military resources and settlers, French colonial authorities cultivated strategic alliances with the Huron, Algonquin, and other indigenous nations. These partnerships were reinforced through trade relationships, diplomatic ceremonies, and even intermarriage. French traders adopted indigenous survival techniques, learning to navigate waters by canoe, travel on snowshoes, and hunt using native methods. Most remarkable were the coureurs de bois, literally runners of the woods, who ventured beyond French settlements to live among indigenous peoples. These independent traders became cultural intermediaries, often learning indigenous languages, adopting local customs, and sometimes taking indigenous wives. Though French authorities frequently attempted to regulate their activities, the coureurs de bois played a crucial role in expanding French influence throughout the Great Lakes region and Mississippi Valley. The Jesuit missionaries represented another distinctive aspect of French colonization. Unlike Spanish missionaries, who often accompanied conquering armies, Jesuit black robes established missions in indigenous villages, learning local languages and documenting native cultures, even as they sought converts. Their detailed reports, known as the Jesuit Relations, provided Europeans with unprecedented insights into indigenous societies while creating tension between traditional beliefs and Catholic teaching. Despite these innovations, New France struggled with chronic population shortages. While British colonies attracted thousands of settlers annually, French immigration remained minimal. By 1663, after more than half a century of settlement, the colony's European population numbered only about 3,000 people. This demographic weakness stemmed from both the harsh Canadian climate and restrictive French policies that limited immigration to Catholics of good character. Recognizing both the potential and vulnerabilities of New France, King Louis XIV took direct control in 1663, transforming it into a royal colony. The king dispatched the Carignan Salieres Regiment, more than 1,000 professional soldiers, to defend against Iroquois raids and appointed a royal governor and intendant to administer the territory. This reorganization marked the beginning of more substantial French investment in North American colonization. While King Louis XIV was strengthening France's position in North America, a far more profitable segment of the French colonial empire was already taking shape thousands of miles away. In the warm waters of the Caribbean, France was establishing a colonial system so profitable that a single island would eventually generate more revenue than all 13 British American colonies combined. The Caribbean expansion began in 1635, when France claimed Guadeloupe and Martinique, establishing its presence in islands already known for their agricultural potential. Unlike the fur-focused economy of New France, these tropical possessions were developed specifically for plantation agriculture, primarily sugar. The initial settlements were organized by the Company of the American Islands, which received a royal charter to develop French interests in the region. By 1659, France had seized part of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, from Spain, beginning what would become the crown jewel of its colonial possessions. Within decades, this colony transformed into an agricultural powerhouse through the brutal exploitation of enslaved African labor. The plantation system required massive numbers of workers, leading France to become deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade. French ships transported millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic under horrific conditions to work on these plantations. The economic results were staggering. By the 18th century, Saint-Domingue alone produced approximately 40% of all the sugar and 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe. This single colony became the most profitable European possession in the Americas, outproducing entire mainland empires. The wealth generated from these Caribbean possessions flowed back to France, enriching merchant families in port cities like Nantes, Bordeaux, and Marseille. To regulate the increasingly complex system of slavery, Louis XIV issued the Code Noir in 1685. This legal framework defined the conditions of slavery in the French colonial empire, controlling every aspect of enslaved people's lives, while also, paradoxically, providing certain protections. The code required slave owners to provide food and clothing, prohibited certain forms of punishment, and even allowed slaves to report abuses to royal authorities. However, these protections existed alongside brutal provisions that defined enslaved people as property and prescribed harsh punishments, including execution for various offenses. France's imperial vision extended beyond the Caribbean. In the Indian Ocean, France established a presence on Isle Bourbon, now Réunion, in 1665, followed by settlements on Isle de France, now Mauritius. These islands served as strategic bases for French ships traveling to and from India, while also developing their own plantation economies, producing spices, coffee, and sugar. The East India Company, founded by Colbert in 1664, coordinated these operations from its headquarters in Lorient, France. The growing French Empire inevitably led to conflicts with other European powers. The prosperous sugar islands became frequent targets during wars, with islands changing hands multiple times between France, Britain, and the Netherlands. Naval power became increasingly crucial for defending these scattered possessions, leading France to invest heavily in its fleet. The Caribbean colonies also fostered a thriving community of pirates and privateers. The island of Tortuga, off the coast of Saint-Domingue, became a notorious base for buccaneers who attacked Spanish shipping. Many operated with tacit French approval through letters of marque, which allowed them to raid enemy ships while providing a percentage of their spoils to the French crown. a form of unofficial warfare that strengthened France's position without requiring direct military involvement. While the Caribbean became the crown jewel of France's Atlantic Empire, across the globe, another imperial contest was unfolding in an arena where France arrived fashionably late: the exotic markets of Asia. Here, the French faced formidable opponents already entrenched in the region's lucrative trade networks. In 1664, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's brilliant finance minister, established the French East India Company with the ambitious goal of challenging the Portuguese, Dutch, and British powers that had already carved out spheres of influence across Asia. The company received royal backing and substantial financing of 15 million livres, a fortune at the time, reflecting Louis XIV's determination to project French power globally. The French strategy differed markedly from their British rivals. While the British East India Company increasingly focused on territorial acquisition, the French emphasized commercial relationships and diplomatic partnerships with local rulers. This approach was partly born of necessity. Arriving decades after their competitors meant the French had to find alternative inroads into established markets. France's first significant foothold came in 1674, when Francois Martin established a trading post at Pondicherry on India's Coromandel coast. From this modest beginning, initially just a small strip of coastal land, Pondicherry would grow into the administrative center of French India. The settlement's distinctive grid pattern and French architectural influences can still be seen in the city today, a lasting reminder of this colonial encounter. The French gradually expanded their presence, establishing additional comptoirs, trading posts at strategic locations. Chandernagore and Bengal provided access to the rich textile markets of eastern India, while Mahé on the Malabar coast connected French merchants to the valuable pepper and spice trade. These settlements were carefully positioned to tap into existing trade routes, while avoiding direct confrontation with more powerful European rivals. Unlike in the Caribbean, where France imposed plantation economies based on slavery, in India, the French operated primarily as merchants, purchasing finished goods from local producers. The French East India Company traded in fine textiles like calicos and muslins, indigo dyes, saltpeter for gunpowder, spices, and luxury items such as diamonds from the famous Golconda mines. These goods commanded premium prices in European markets, enriching both the company and the French crown. The French worked to cultivate relationships with Indian powers, particularly the Mughal Empire and various regional kingdoms. In 1687, French envoys reached the court of Emperor Aurangzeb, securing trading privileges that strengthened their commercial position. These diplomatic efforts represented a sophisticated understanding that in Asia, unlike in the Americas, Europeans needed to negotiate rather than simply conquer. French ambitions extended beyond India to Southeast Asia. In 1680, the East India Company dispatched Pierre Poivre to Vietnam, establishing initial contacts that would eventually lead to later colonial endeavors. These early missions focused on trade and Catholic missionary work rather than territorial control. Perhaps the most dramatic episode in early French Asian expansion came in Siam, modern Thailand. In 1687, Louis XIV sent an ambitious embassy with over 600 soldiers to the court of King Narai, hoping to secure both trade advantages and convert the king to Catholicism. This overreach triggered a nationalist backlash, culminating in the 1688 Siamese Revolution. Anti-foreign factions executed the pro-French officials, expelled the French military contingent, and forced the missionaries to flee, a humiliating setback that revealed the limits of French influence. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, completed an extraordinary journey that would reshape the map of North America. After navigating the length of the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle performed a dramatic ceremony at the river's delta. He erected a column, buried an engraved plate, and proclaimed in the name of King Louis XIV possession of a territory he named Louisiana, a vast inland empire stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains. This massive territorial claim represented a strategic masterstroke for French imperial ambitions. By controlling the Mississippi watershed, France created a geographic vice grip around the British colonies, effectively hemming them in along the Atlantic seaboard. Louisiana formed a crucial connector between the fur trading economy of New France in the north and the plantation colonies of the Caribbean to the south. The territory encompassed nearly one-third of what would later become the continental United States, a landmass larger than France itself. Unlike the densely populated British colonies, French Louisiana remained remarkably underpopulated throughout its history. By 1708, the European population numbered fewer than 300 people scattered across a handful of isolated trading posts. This sparse settlement pattern reflected France's different colonial approach. Rather than sending large numbers of settlers, French authorities established a network of strategic forts and trading stations, including Fort de Mississippi, Arkansas Post, and later Fort Orleans, to maintain territorial claims while developing commercial relationships with indigenous nations. Indigenous alliances proved essential to French control. Diplomatic agreements with the Choctaw, Natchez, Illinois, and other nations secured French trade routes and provided crucial military support against British and Spanish encroachment. These partnerships, however, remained fragile and occasionally erupted into violence, as demonstrated by the Natchez Revolt of 1729, which temporarily devastated French settlements in that region. The Louisiana Territory's economy initially focused on the fur trade, particularly deer hides and beaver pelts, but French authorities soon attempted to diversify. Experimental plantations growing tobacco, indigo, and later sugar were established, though these struggled compared to Caribbean counterparts. The colony's harsh environmental conditions, including frequent flooding, tropical diseases, and hurricane threats along the Gulf Coast, deterred potential settlers and complicated agricultural development. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht redrew North America's imperial boundaries, forcing France to cede territories in Newfoundland and Acadia to Britain. This diplomatic setback heightened Louisiana's strategic importance as a buffer against British expansion. 5 years later, in 1718, the French founded New Orleans as Louisiana's new capital, a carefully chosen location that controlled access to the Mississippi River system and could serve as an administrative and military center for the entire territory. The city's establishment marked France's determination to maintain its continental claims despite limited resources and competing imperial priorities. Yet Louisiana remained chronically underfunded and undermanned throughout the French period. The financial strain became so severe that in 1717, the French crown transferred the colony's administration to John Law's Company of the West, later the Company of the Indies, hoping private enterprise might succeed where state management had struggled. While Louisiana struggled under private management, a far greater challenge was brewing across the Atlantic, one that would shake the foundations of France's entire colonial enterprise. What happens when the world's most powerful monarch gambles his empire on a Spanish inheritance and loses nearly everything in the process? In 1700, the death of King Charles II of Spain triggered a succession crisis that would reshape European politics and colonial possessions for generations. The childless Spanish king had named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his heir, potentially uniting the French and Spanish thrones under Bourbon family control. This prospect alarmed other European powers, who feared the creation of an overwhelming French-Spanish superpower that would dominate Europe and the Americas. Britain, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German states formed the Grand Alliance to prevent this outcome, launching what became known as the War of Spanish Succession in 1701. The conflict stretched across Europe and spilled into colonial territories, transforming a European dynastic dispute into the first truly global war. France found itself fighting on multiple fronts, with dwindling resources and mounting casualties. The war proved catastrophic for France's imperial ambitions. While Louis XIV's army fought desperately in Europe, Britain's growing naval superiority allowed it to strike directly at French colonial possessions. French settlements in the Caribbean became particularly vulnerable, with Britain seizing St. Kitts in 1702. In North America, British forces captured the crucial fortress of Port Royal in Acadia in 1710, gaining control over the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, the lifeline of New France. By 1712, the exhausted French state was on the verge of financial collapse. Military expenses had devastated the treasury, while agricultural failures and trade disruptions created domestic hardship. Louis XIV, now in his 70s and having witnessed the deaths of his son and eldest grandson during the war, reluctantly accepted peace terms that dramatically reduced French power. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht forced France to surrender substantial territories, including Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia, renamed Nova Scotia, to Britain. These losses critically weakened New France's defensive perimeter, leaving Quebec vulnerable to future British attacks. In the Caribbean, France ceded its claims to St. Kitts, while retaining its valuable sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. The treaty permitted Philip V to remain on the Spanish throne, but only after he renounced all claims to the French crown. More importantly, Spain and France were explicitly forbidden from uniting their empires, with provisions requiring that the two Bourbon monarchies must forever remain separate. This separation prevented France from accessing Spain's vast American silver wealth, which might have restored French finances. Britain emerged as the clear victor, gaining not only French territories but also the Asiento, a valuable contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. Combined with new naval bases and trading privileges, this marked Britain's emergence as the dominant Atlantic power, fundamentally altering the colonial balance of power. The world was about to witness a conflict unlike any before. While previous wars had been largely confined to single continents, the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756 as the first truly global confrontation, with the battlefield stretching from the forests of North America to the plains of India. This wasn't merely a European power struggle. It was a fight for global dominance that would permanently reshape the colonial landscape. For France, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Under Louis XV, the French Empire had recovered somewhat from the setbacks of the War of Spanish Succession. But tensions with Britain had been simmering for years, particularly in the contested Ohio Valley, where both powers sought to expand. When a young George Washington led Virginia militiamen against French forces at Fort Duquesne in 1754, he unknowingly lit the fuse of a global powder keg. The war quickly expanded beyond North America. In Europe, traditional alliances shattered in what historians called the Diplomatic Revolution, with France aligning with its longtime enemy Austria against Prussia and Great Britain. Meanwhile, far from European shores, British and French forces clashed across India, Africa, and the Caribbean. For the first time in history, military planners had to consider strategy on a truly global scale. In North America, the tide initially favored France. French forces and their indigenous allies won several early victories, utilizing superior woodland tactics against British regulars, unused to frontier warfare. But the war's momentum shifted dramatically after William Pitt became Britain's war minister in 1757. Pitt recognized the global nature of the conflict and committed unprecedented resources to winning in North America. The consequences were devastating for French ambitions. In September 1759, British forces under General James Wolfe captured Quebec in a daring assault up the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham. Though both Wolfe and his French counterpart, Montcalm, died in the battle, the loss of Quebec dealt a mortal blow to New France. Montreal fell the following year, effectively ending France's century-and-a-half presence in Canada. Across the globe in India, the pattern repeated itself. Robert Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757 over French-supported local forces established British dominance in Bengal. This triumph wasn't just a military victory, it gave Britain control over one of the richest regions in India and relegated France to a minor colonial player on the subcontinent. Even in the Caribbean, where France maintained its valuable sugar islands, British naval superiority proved decisive. Guadeloupe fell in 1759, followed by Martinique in 1762. Though immensely valuable for their sugar production, these islands would ultimately be returned to France in the final peace settlement, a decision that sparked controversy in Britain. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized France's imperial collapse. The terms were harsh. France surrendered Canada and all territories east of the Mississippi to Britain. To compensate their Spanish allies who had entered the war late, France transferred Louisiana west of the Mississippi to Spain. French possessions in India were reduced to a handful of trading posts. Only in the Caribbean did France retain significant colonies, with Britain returning Martinique and Guadeloupe in exchange for Canada, a trade that many in Britain questioned given the sugar islands' greater economic value. The world was about to witness a conflict unlike any before. While France's overseas territories had been carved up by foreign powers, from the ashes of imperial defeat would rise something far more threatening to the established order. The French Revolution that began in 1789 with demands for liberty, equality, and fraternity ultimately created the conditions for one of history's most ambitious military dictators to build a new French empire. By 1799, a decade of revolutionary upheaval had exhausted France. The Directory, a 5-member committee ruling the nation, faced financial crisis, military setbacks, and widespread public discontent. Into this power vacuum stepped a 30-year-old military commander whose reputation had been forged on battleships across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, already celebrated for his brilliant Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797, seized power through a carefully orchestrated coup d'état on November 9 through 10, 1799. Napoleon's path to power began on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, which had been annexed by France just a year before his birth in 1769. His military education and tactical genius propelled him through the ranks during the Revolutionary period. By 1798, seeking to strike at British interests and build his own legend, Napoleon led an ambitious expedition to Egypt. While the campaign ultimately failed militarily, It produced significant scientific and cultural outcomes, including the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a trilingual inscription that would eventually allow scholars to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. As first consul of France, Napoleon moved swiftly to consolidate power and rebuild a nation fractured by revolution. His administrative reforms created a centralized government, with prefects appointed to manage departments across France. The Napoleonic Code of 1804 standardized French law, enshrining revolutionary principles like equality before the law, while maintaining patriarchal authority within families. This legal framework would ultimately influence legal systems across Europe and the Americas. Napoleon's pragmatic approach to governance was evident in his religious policy. The Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII healed the decade-long breach between revolutionary France and the Catholic Church. While recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, the agreement maintained state control over ecclesiastical appointments and religious practice. This calculated compromise restored stability while preventing the Church from regaining its pre-revolutionary influence. Even as Napoleon rebuilt order in France, the empire faced significant colonial challenges. In Saint-Domingue, formerly France's most profitable colony, enslaved people had seized the revolutionary promise of equality and launched their own struggle for freedom. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who had become a brilliant military and political strategist, the revolution survived repeated French attempts to restore control. Napoleon initially sent 20,000 troops under his brother-in-law General Leclerc to reconquer the colony and re-establish slavery, but disease and determined resistance decimated French forces. The failure in Saint-Domingue directly influenced Napoleon's next major colonial decision. In 1803, he sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States for 60 million francs, approximately $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the young American Republic. This pragmatic transaction allowed Napoleon to focus on European conquests while depriving Britain of a potential foothold in North America. Jefferson's negotiators, originally sent to purchase just New Orleans, were shocked when offered the entire territory spanning from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The world witnessed a dramatic shift when Napoleon Bonaparte, having gained control of France through his coup, set his sights on something far greater. With the Louisiana territory sold and colonial ambitions redirected, Napoleon turned his attention toward a transformation that would shock Europe. What kind of military commander crowns himself sovereign? On December 2, 1804, Notre Dame Cathedral became the stage for an unprecedented spectacle. As Pope Pius VII held the crown during the coronation ceremony, Napoleon seized it from the pontiff's hands and placed it upon his own head before crowning his wife Josephine. This audacious act symbolized that his authority came not from God or church, but from himself alone. The gesture wasn't merely theatrical, it represented the final transformation of revolutionary France into an imperial power, with Napoleon as its absolute ruler. The coronation ceremony deliberately evoked imagery of Charlemagne and the Roman emperors, with Napoleon dressed in purple velvet robes embroidered with golden bees. The artist Jacques-Louis David immortalized the moment in his massive painting that portrayed the event not as it actually happened, but as Napoleon wished it to be remembered, with his mother prominently featured, though she had refused to attend the ceremony. Beyond symbolic gestures, Napoleon consolidated power through institutional reforms. His administration reorganized France's educational system, establishing lycées that trained future civil servants loyal to the regime. He created a new aristocracy based on merit rather than birth, awarding titles like Duke, Count, and Baron to military officers and civil administrators who demonstrated exceptional service to the empire. Napoleon's family became instruments of his expanding power across Europe. His brother Joseph was installed as King of Naples in 1806, later becoming King of Spain. Louis became King of Holland, and Jerome was made King of Westphalia. His stepson Eugene de Beauharnais governed as Viceroy of Italy, while his sister Caroline and her husband Joachim Murat eventually ruled Naples. This Bonaparte dynasty extended French influence across the continent more effectively than armies alone could achieve. Beneath the imperial splendor, Napoleon maintained tight control over information and opposition. His regime employed hundreds of censors who reviewed newspapers, books, and theater productions. The secret police under Joseph Fouché monitored potential dissidents, while the infamous administrative detention allowed imprisonment without trial for those deemed threats to state security. When General Jean Moreau, once Napoleon's rival for power, was implicated in a royalist plot in 1804, his public trial in exile demonstrated the consequences of opposing the emperor. The machinery of the empire demanded unprecedented resources. Conscription pulled hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen into military service, with annual levies increasing from 30,000 to over 150,000 men during the imperial period. New taxes on salt, tobacco, and alcoholic beverages funded military campaigns, while the Continental system, Napoleon's ambitious blockade against British trade, disrupted Europe's economy and everyday life. Throughout this period of political transformation, French culture and science flourished under imperial patronage. The Egyptian campaign had sparked scientific interest that continued under the empire, with government funding for research in chemistry, mathematics, and engineering. In 1804, Joseph Nicéphore Niepce began experiments with light-sensitive materials that would eventually lead to the development of photography, though the first permanent photograph wouldn't be created until 1826. Unable to defeat Britain on the high seas, Napoleon Bonaparte turned to a different kind of warfare in 1806. Through the Berlin Decree, he formalized the Continental system, a grand economic strategy designed to strangle the British economy by cutting off its trade with Europe. This unprecedented economic blockade required every nation under French influence to close their ports to British ships and ban British goods from their markets. Napoleon believed this commercial isolation would collapse Britain's economy, forcing them to surrender without firing a shot. The Continental system required total European compliance to succeed, pushing Napoleon to extend French control across the continent's coastlines. What began as an economic policy soon became the driving force behind further military campaigns. The emperor needed to seal every potential smuggling route and close every harbor that might welcome British merchants. This ambitious strategy transformed the map of Europe as French forces marched into Italy, Germany, Holland, and the Dalmatian coast. Britain's initial economic pain was substantial. Their exports dropped by a quarter as warehouses filled with unsold goods, triggering worker protests in manufacturing regions. But the British government responded with counter-blockades through orders in council, effectively declaring that neutral ships trading with French-controlled ports would be seized. Meanwhile, British merchants quickly adapted by establishing elaborate smuggling networks and diverting trade through neutral intermediaries. The greatest irony of the Continental system was how it damaged France's own prosperity. French manufacturers lost access to raw materials, Colonial goods became prohibitively expensive, and port cities that once thrived on international commerce saw their harbors empty. In Hamburg, Bremen, and Amsterdam, once bustling trading hubs fell silent as maritime commerce collapsed. When coffee prices rose tenfold in Paris, desperate merchants sold chicory root as a substitute, a practice that continues in some regions today. Napoleon's attempts to enforce the blockade alienated his allies and subjects. Dutch merchants, Spanish traders, and German burghers who had built their livelihoods on commerce now faced financial ruin under French economic dictates. These hardships planted seeds of resentment that would later bloom into resistance. The Continental system became increasingly difficult to maintain as smuggling flourished along Europe's vast coastlines. British goods arrived in continental markets disguised as Swedish, Russian, or American products, while corrupt officials often looked the other way for the right price. The system's enforcement led to diplomatic crises with non-compliant nations. Portugal's refusal to close its ports to British trade triggered the French invasion of 1807, pulling Napoleon into the Spanish quagmire that would become his Spanish ulcer. More significantly, Russia's gradual withdrawal from the system by 1811 set the stage for Napoleon's catastrophic 1812 invasion. While the Continental system failed to achieve its primary objective of defeating Britain, it sparked unexpected consequences across the Atlantic. The United States, caught between British and French trade restrictions, turned inward. American textile mills, ironworks, and manufacturing plants sprang up as European imports became unavailable. This unintended catalyst for American industrial development ultimately strengthened the young republic that would later emerge as a global power. While Napoleon's economic warfare against Britain faltered, his ambitions in Spain would become his most disastrous miscalculation. In 1808, Napoleon's dynastic aspirations led him to remove the Spanish Bourbon monarchy and install his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. This political maneuver, which seemed like a simple extension of his family empire, ignited an unprecedented popular uprising that would drain French imperial resources for years to come. The Spanish resistance began dramatically on May 2, 1808, when citizens of Madrid rose against French occupation troops. The French response was brutal, mass executions of civilians that, rather than crushing resistance, transformed isolated protests into a nationwide rebellion. What Napoleon had expected to be a straightforward territorial acquisition became what historians would later call his Spanish ulcer, a wound that continuously drained French strength and resources. The Spanish people's resistance introduced a new form of warfare that the French military was ill-equipped to confront. Local fighters operating in small bands across mountainous terrain attacked French supply lines, isolated garrisons, and communication networks. These tactics gave birth to the term guerrilla, meaning little war in Spanish, reflecting the popular character of the resistance. Unlike traditional armies, these fighters melted into the civilian population, making it impossible for French forces to distinguish friend from foe. The conflict's intensity was unprecedented. Civilians from all social classes participated in the struggle against French occupation, transforming conventional warfare into a people's war. Spanish fighters ambushed French patrols, destroyed bridges, intercepted messages, and assassinated collaborators. The French responded with collective punishment, executing suspected guerrillas and burning villages, which only intensified Spanish hatred and determination to expel the invaders. British intervention proved crucial to the Spanish resistance. Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal with British forces to support Spanish and Portuguese fighters. While guerrillas disrupted French operations, Wellington's conventional forces engaged the French in pitched battles, creating a two-front war that stretched Napoleon's military capabilities. Napoleon himself recognized the growing threat and personally led a campaign into Spain in late 1808 with 200,000 troops. He achieved several victories but was forced to depart to address Austrian threats elsewhere, leaving his generals to continue a war that was becoming increasingly unwinnable. The absence of the emperor allowed the insurgency to resurge with greater intensity. The Catholic Church became a powerful catalyst for resistance, framing the struggle as a religious war against French godlessness. Priests stirred up anti-French sentiment, portraying Napoleon as an enemy of Catholicism and the occupation as an attack on Spanish religious traditions. This religious dimension transformed the conflict from a political struggle into a sacred duty for many Spaniards. By 1812, over 300,000 French troops, a third of Napoleon's entire military, were tied down in Spain, forces desperately needed elsewhere as European powers began to unite against French dominance. The conflict's brutality inspired Francisco Goya's haunting depictions of war's horrors, particularly his famous painting The 3rd of May, 1808, which captured the terror of French reprisals against Spanish civilians. With a third of his military trapped in the Spanish quagmire, Napoleon nevertheless turned his gaze eastward to Russia in 1812. The campaign that followed would transform the Grande Armée from history's most formidable fighting force into frozen corpses scattered across the Russian steppes, a catastrophe so complete that of the 680,000 soldiers who marched proudly across the Niemen River on June 24th, fewer than 100,000 would return. At the heart of this conflict was Russia's withdrawal from the Continental system, threatening Napoleon's economic strategy against Britain. When diplomacy failed, Napoleon assembled the largest military force Europe had ever seen, a multinational army comprising French, Polish, Italian, German, and other European troops. The sheer logistics of moving and feeding such a massive force would prove nearly impossible over the vast Russian landscape. From the campaign's outset, Russian commanders Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov implemented a brilliantly simple strategy: continuous retreat while destroying everything of value. As Napoleon's forces pushed deeper into Russia, they found villages burned, wells poisoned, and grain fields torched. The Russians sacrificed their own resources to deny them to the invaders, drawing the French into an ever-lengthening supply line through increasingly barren territory. On September 7, 1812, the two armies finally clashed at the Battle of Borodino, a monumental engagement that left approximately 70,000 casualties in a single day. Though technically a French victory, the battle achieved no strategic breakthrough. The Russians simply withdrew in good order, and on September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow to find an eerily abandoned city. Within hours, Moscow erupted in flames. Whether set deliberately by Russian authorities or accidentally by looters, the fire consumed nearly 2/3 of the city over 4 days. Napoleon found himself in possession of a charred, empty prize with winter approaching. For 5 critical weeks, he waited in Moscow, hoping Tsar Alexander would negotiate. The Tsar never replied. By October 19th, facing dwindling supplies in the first frost, Napoleon ordered the retreat that would destroy his army. His soldiers, who had marched into Russia in summer uniforms, now faced temperatures that plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. The retreat quickly became a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Soldiers froze to death while standing at their posts. Others stripped clothing from the dead to survive another day. Supply wagons were abandoned as horses collapsed from hunger. Starving men resorted to eating their mounts raw. Russian forces under Generals Kutuzov, Platov, and Miloradovich constantly harassed the retreating columns. Cossack cavalry swooped down on stragglers, while Russian partisans ambushed isolated units. At the Berezina River crossing in late November, thousands drowned or froze trying to escape pursuing Russian forces. By December, the once magnificent Grand Armée had disintegrated into small bands of frozen, starving men struggling westward. The scale of the disaster profoundly altered European politics. Prussia, long a reluctant French ally, switched sides in February 1813. Austria and Sweden soon joined what became the Sixth Coalition against Napoleon. With his army shattered, Napoleon hastily raised new forces, mostly inexperienced conscripts. Despite several tactical victories in the spring of 1813, the coalition's numerical superiority proved overwhelming. The decisive confrontation came at Leipzig in October 1813, aptly named the Battle of Nations, as it pitted French forces against Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes. After 4 days of fighting, Napoleon's army suffered a crushing defeat, forcing a retreat to France itself. By March 1814, coalition forces entered Paris, and on April 6th, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. Napoleon's abdication seemed to close the chapter on France's imperial ambitions, but less than a year later, the impossible happened. On February 26, 1815, the deposed emperor slipped away from his Mediterranean exile on Elba with a mere 1,000 loyal followers. When he landed on the southern French coast on March 1st, his audacious gamble began, either a triumphant return or a quick execution as a traitor. What followed defied all expectations. As Napoleon marched northward toward Paris, something remarkable occurred. Rather than arresting him as ordered, regiment after regiment of the regular French army switched sides. Emotional scenes unfolded as soldiers who had once fought under Napoleon's banner recognized their former commander. Many troops sent to capture him instead broke ranks, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" and pledging renewed loyalty to the man they had followed across Europe. The march to Paris became less a military campaign than a procession. Louis XVIII, who had been restored to the throne after Napoleon's first abdication, recognized the shifting tide. By March 20th, just 3 weeks after landing, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph as the king fled to Belgium. Without firing a single shot, the former exile had reclaimed one of Europe's most powerful thrones through sheer force of personality. Europe's reaction was swift and uncompromising. The great powers assembled at the Congress of Vienna, still redrawing the map of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing their armies to remove the returned emperor permanently. They would accept nothing less than his complete elimination from the European stage. Napoleon understood that diplomatic solutions were impossible. His only hope lay in swift military action before the coalition armies could combine against him. By June 1815, he had assembled a remarkable force of 125,000 men, a testament to his organizational genius, and moved into Belgium with a clear strategy: defeat the British and Prussian armies separately before they could join forces. The critical confrontation came on June 18, 1815, near the small Belgian village of Waterloo. Napoleon's 72,000 troops faced Wellington's allied force of 68,000 men. The French emperor had reason for confidence. He outnumbered his immediate opponent and had defeated both Wellington and Blücher separately in previous engagements. But fate and weather intervened. Heavy rains the previous night had turned the battlefield into mud, delaying Napoleon's attack and giving the Prussian forces crucial extra hours to march to Wellington's aid. The battle itself unfolded as a series of bloody engagements. Napoleon's initial artillery bombardment proved less effective than planned due to the soggy ground. His infantry attacks against Wellington's center were repeatedly repulsed. When the French cavalry charged the British squares, they too were unable to break through the disciplined Allied formations. As the afternoon wore on, Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard, soldiers who had never known defeat, in a final desperate assault. The arrival of Prussian reinforcements under General Blücher proved decisive. Caught between Wellington's forces and the Prussian flanking attack, Napoleon's army collapsed. The catastrophic defeat resulted in approximately 25,000 French casualties and 8,000 captured. Napoleon's gamble had failed completely, ending his rule after just 100 days. The consequences were immediate and permanent. Napoleon abdicated for the second time, and this time there would be no return. The British transported him to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena, a volcanic rock thousands of miles from Europe, where he would remain until his death in 1821. When Napoleon died in 1821, the Bonaparte dynasty seemed permanently extinguished. Yet history often delivers unexpected sequels. 31 years later, his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, accomplished what many thought impossible, resurrecting the French Empire from the ashes of revolution and monarchy. The path to this second empire began with Louis Napoleon winning France's first presidential election in December 1848, with an overwhelming 74% of the vote. As the newly elected president of the Second Republic, he positioned himself as a figure of stability during a period of social and political turbulence. However, his ambitions extended far beyond the 4-year term imposed by the Constitution. Facing the legal impossibility of running for re-election, Louis Napoleon executed a bold coup d'état on December 2, 1851, exactly 47 years after his uncle's coronation. He dissolved the National Assembly and arrested potential opponents in a single night. With opposition neutralized, he called for a plebiscite to approve a new constitution that extended his presidential term to 10 years. This maneuver proved extraordinarily successful, setting the stage for his final transformation into emperor. 1 year later, on December 2, 1852, Louis Napoleon formally proclaimed the Second French Empire, with himself as Emperor Napoleon III, acknowledging both his uncle and a short-lived son who never actually ruled. The swift transition from republic to empire demonstrated the enduring appeal of the Bonaparte name and the French public's willingness to sacrifice democratic principles for promises of stability and national greatness. Unlike his militarily focused uncle, Napoleon III's vision for France centered on economic development and urban modernization. He launched an unprecedented reconstruction of Paris under Baron Haussmann, replacing medieval neighborhoods with wide boulevards, parks, and modern infrastructure. These grand avenues served multiple purposes, improving public health, showcasing imperial splendor, and allowing troops to move quickly to suppress potential rebellions. The emperor embraced industrial development with remarkable enthusiasm. Railways expanded dramatically under his rule, while new banks provided crucial financing for factories and commercial enterprises. This economic liberalism created a strange hybrid system, an authoritarian empire fueling capitalist development and middle-class prosperity. In colonial affairs, Napoleon III pursued what historians have called a peace empire, focusing on economic investment and diplomatic relationships rather than pure military conquest. He consolidated French control in Algeria, which had been partially conquered in 1830, and expanded French influence in Senegal and other parts of West Africa. His approach emphasized what he termed imperial responsibility, viewing French colonialism as a civilizing mission that would extend French values across the globe. This emerging colonial vision represented a fundamental shift from his uncle's European-focused conquests. While Napoleon I had sold Louisiana and abandoned Haiti, Napoleon III actively sought new territories in Africa and Asia, establishing the foundation for France's second colonial empire that would continue expanding even after his own fall from power. Despite his emphasis on economic development and diplomatic relationships, Napoleon III did not completely abandon military adventures. His eventual participation in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, demonstrated his desire to restore France's position as a major European power, but it also revealed a more collaborative approach through alliance with Britain, France's traditional enemy. This alliance with Britain, once unthinkable, signaled how far Napoleon III would go to restore French prestige after decades of post-Waterloo humiliation. When Russian troops invaded Ottoman territories in 1853, Napoleon III saw not a distant conflict, but the perfect opportunity to rewrite France's place in the world order through blood, innovation, and a war unlike any that had come before. The conflict began with a seemingly minor religious dispute over who would control Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. While Russia claimed protection rights over Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, France asserted similar privileges for Catholics. This diplomatic tension escalated when Tsar Nicholas I sent troops into Ottoman territories along the Danube, prompting the Sultan to declare war. Napoleon III, sensing an opportunity to check Russian expansion and demonstrate French power, quickly formed an alliance with Britain, France's traditional rival. What followed transformed warfare itself. When Allied forces landed in Crimea in September 1854, they brought with them revolutionary technologies never before seen in combat. Telegraph lines transmitted battle reports across Europe within hours, while photographers like Roger Fenton captured haunting images of war for civilian audiences. Railways transported supplies and wounded soldiers, while new explosive shells and rifled muskets inflicted unprecedented casualties. The centerpiece of the conflict became the 11-month siege of Sevastopol, where French engineering and military prowess proved decisive. French sappers dug elaborate trench systems, while their artillery pounded Russian fortifications with devastating effect. By September 1855, when Russian forces finally abandoned the smoking ruins of Sevastopol, French military prestige had been dramatically restored through battlefield accomplishments that Napoleon Bonaparte himself would have admired. Yet glory came at a terrible cost. Disease ravaged Allied camps, with cholera and typhus killing more soldiers than enemy fire. These conditions spurred medical innovations that would change healthcare forever. While Florence Nightingale revolutionized British military nursing, French nursing sisters like Sœur Rosalie Rendu implemented similar reforms in French field hospitals. The Sisters of Charity established new standards of battlefield care that would influence military medicine for generations. The diplomatic triumph came in March 1856, when European powers gathered in Paris for peace negotiations. Napoleon III himself presided over the conference, a powerful symbol of France's return to diplomatic preeminence. The resulting Treaty of Paris severely restricted Russian naval power in the Black Sea and limited Russian influence in the Ottoman Empire, establishing the principle of Ottoman territorial integrity under Great Power Guarantee. For the first time since Waterloo, France had dictated terms to a major European power. The aftermath transformed French imperial ambitions. With renewed military confidence, France accelerated colonial projects across the globe. Napoleon III deepened involvement in Algeria, expanded presence in Senegal, and established a protectorate in Cambodia. The victory over Russia provided both the confidence and international prestige needed to pursue these far-flung ventures without serious European opposition. Perhaps most significantly, the war transformed Anglo-French relations. Former enemies became allies, cooperating militarily against a common threat. This new understanding would reshape colonial competition, as both powers increasingly coordinated their imperial ambitions rather than directly confronting each other. The precedent of cooperation established in Crimean trenches would influence European diplomacy for decades. The diplomatic triumph in Crimea emboldened Napoleon III to pursue his most catastrophic imperial gamble. In Mexico, France would attempt something no European power had dared since American independence, establishing a new monarchy in the Western Hemisphere, directly challenging the Monroe Doctrine that had kept European powers at bay for decades. The opportunity arose in 1861, when Mexico, under President Benito Juárez, suspended payments on its foreign debts. What began as a seemingly straightforward debt collection quickly revealed Napoleon III's true ambitions. While Britain and Spain joined the initial expedition, they quickly withdrew once they realized France's actual goal wasn't financial compensation, but territorial conquest. Napoleon III envisioned a French-aligned empire that would serve as a counterweight to growing American influence and provide access to Mexican silver mines. The French invasion encountered unexpected resistance almost immediately. On May 5, 1862, at the Battle of Puebla, Mexican forces achieved a stunning victory against the French army. Though ultimately just a temporary setback for France, this battle, commemorated today as Cinco de Mayo, became a powerful symbol of Mexican resistance and national pride. The French advance slowed but didn't stop, and by June 1863, French forces captured Mexico City. With military control established in central Mexico, Napoleon III moved forward with his grand imperial design. He selected Archduke Maximilian of Austria, a Habsburg prince with liberal leanings, as the new Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian arrived in 1864 with his ambitious wife Charlotte, known as Carlota in Mexico, convinced they would be welcomed as modernizing rulers who could stabilize the war-torn nation. The reality proved far different. Outside major cities, Juárez's Republican forces maintained control of significant territory, especially in the north. French troops, eventually numbering around 40,000, found themselves in an increasingly costly occupation against determined resistance. Mexican guerrilla fighters employed tactics similar to those used by Spanish forces against Napoleon I, striking French supply lines and isolating garrisons. The situation deteriorated further for France when the American Civil War ended in 1865. The United States, now able to focus on foreign affairs, began providing diplomatic support and weapons to Juárez's government. American officials made clear their opposition to European monarchies in the Western Hemisphere, placing diplomatic pressure on France while positioning troops along the Rio Grande as a not-so-subtle warning. By 1866, the Mexican adventure had become a strategic and financial disaster for Napoleon III. The occupation was costing France approximately 50 million francs annually, with no end in sight. Domestic criticism mounted as French casualties increased and international isolation grew. Facing these realities, Napoleon III ordered a phased withdrawal of French troops, despite knowing this would doom Maximilian's regime. Maximilian refused to abandon his adopted country, even as French forces departed. His loyalty proved fatal. Republican forces captured him in May 1867, and despite international pleas for clemency, Maximilian faced a firing squad on June 19, 1867. The execution, immortalized in Edouard Manet's famous paintings, shocked European royal houses and symbolized the catastrophic failure of Napoleon III's imperial vision. While the execution of Maximilian marked a humiliating end to French ambitions in Mexico, it would pale in comparison to what happened next. In 1870, a single edited telegram would trigger a chain of events that not only destroyed Napoleon III's empire, but redrew the map of Europe for generations. The crisis began innocently enough with a diplomatic dispute over the Spanish throne. When Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen emerged as a candidate, Napoleon III objected to having Prussian royalty on both French borders. The seemingly minor diplomatic matter became the perfect trap set by Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who had long sought a pretext for war with France to complete German unification under Prussian leadership. The turning point came when Bismarck received a telegram describing a polite but unremarkable meeting between King Wilhelm I of Prussia and the French ambassador. Recognizing an opportunity, Bismarck edited the telegram to make it appear that the king had insulted France. When published, this Ems telegram ignited French public outrage. On July 19, 1870, Napoleon III, hoping to restore his fading popularity with a quick military victory, declared war on Prussia, walking straight into Bismarck's trap. What followed was a stunning military catastrophe. The French military, still trading on its Crimean war reputation, was no match for Prussia's modern war machine. Behind the scenes, the Prussian military had undergone a revolutionary transformation. Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke had developed a sophisticated general staff system, standardized mobilization plans, and mastered the use of railways for troop movements. Prussia could deploy troops 3 times faster than the French, using detailed timetables that specified exactly which units would board specific trains at precise times. Meanwhile, the French military struggled with basic logistics. Soldiers arrived at frontline positions without adequate supplies. Some units lacked maps of their own territory. Communication breakdowns led to contradictory orders and missed opportunities. The technological gap was equally stark. Prussia's Krupp steel breech-loading cannons outranged French bronze artillery, allowing Prussian forces to bombard French positions while remaining safely out of range. The decisive moment came at Sedan on September 1st and 2nd, 1870. The French army of Chalon, numbering 130,000 men, including the emperor himself, found itself surrounded by Prussian forces in a valley near the Belgian border. After a day of devastating artillery fire, Napoleon III faced the unthinkable: surrender. On September 2nd, he personally surrendered to King Wilhelm I, becoming the first French head of state captured in battle, since King Francis I was taken by the Holy Roman Emperor at Pavia in 1525. The news of Napoleon's capture triggered immediate revolt in Paris. On September 4th, crowds stormed government buildings, and the Third Republic was proclaimed. The new government vowed to continue fighting, but Paris itself was soon surrounded by German forces. The brutal siege lasted through a harsh winter, with Parisians reduced to eating zoo animals and rats as food supplies dwindled. German artillery bombarded the city while its residents slowly starved. The humiliation reached its peak on January 18, 1871, when Bismarck orchestrated the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very symbol of French royal power. King Wilhelm I of Prussia was crowned German Emperor as French territories lay occupied around him. The message was unmistakable. A new European order had emerged with Germany, not France, at its center. As the humiliating defeat of 1871 faded into memory, France began searching for new frontiers to restore its wounded national pride. From the ashes of European defeat, a new colonial ambition emerged. Within just 3 decades, a nation that had lost territory at home would control an astonishing 8.6% of the world's land surface, a transformation that came with both triumph and tremendous human cost. The period between 1880 and 1910 witnessed an unprecedented land grab known as the Scramble for Africa. In the 1870s, African nations controlled 90% of their own continent, with European powers holding only coastal territories. This balance of power shifted dramatically as European nations, driven by economic interests and imperial competition, carved up the continent. Explorers, missionaries, and traders returned with reports of vast resources, fueling a frenzy of colonial acquisition. France systematically expanded across the African continent, establishing a colonial domain that eventually stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Congo Basin and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. The conquest of Algeria, which had begun decades earlier in 1830, intensified during this period. The violence of this expansion was staggering. Historians estimate that between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians perished during the French conquest through war, massacres, disease, and famine. Beyond Algeria, French colonial ambitions spread rapidly. Tunisia became a French protectorate in 1881, much to the frustration of Italy, which had its own designs on the territory. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, France seized vast portions of West Africa, including modern-day Senegal, Mali, Niger, and Chad. In Central Africa, territories like Gabon and Congo fell under French control, while Madagascar was conquered in 1896. This imperial competition occasionally brought France into direct conflict with other European powers. The Fashoda incident of 1898 nearly triggered war with Britain when both nations claimed the same territory along the Upper Nile. Ultimately, France withdrew its forces, tacitly acknowledging British dominance in the region and highlighting the competitive nature of this imperial expansion. The methods of conquest varied by region, but typically involved overwhelming military force. Many African groups, including the Ashanti, Fulani, and Tuareg, fought fiercely to maintain their independence, but were ultimately defeated by European weaponry and tactics. The invading powers drew boundaries between their colonies with little regard for existing ethnic groups and kingdoms, creating artificial borders that would later contribute to regional conflicts. While Britain often ruled its colonies indirectly through local authorities, France implemented a policy of assimilation, attempting to transform colonial subjects into Frenchmen. This approach imposed French language, education, and legal systems on colonial populations, while presenting colonization as a civilizing mission, bringing progress to supposedly backward regions. The French Empire extended beyond Africa. In Southeast Asia, France consolidated its holdings in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos into French Indochina by 1887. This vast colonial network provided France with raw materials, markets for manufactured goods, and renewed international prestige. Yet behind the imperial facade lay brutal realities. Colonial authorities routinely used forced labor for infrastructure projects, imposed heavy taxation, and violently suppressed any resistance. Indigenous cultures were systematically undermined, traditional leadership structures dismantled, and local economies restructured to benefit the metropole. While French colonial administrators installed grand boulevards in Hanoi and Dakar, the brutality of their rule wasn't met with passive acceptance. Beneath the surface of apparent control, powerful resistance movements were taking shape across 3 continents, challenging what seemed like unbreakable colonial domination. In Morocco, Abd el-Krim emerged as one of the most successful resistance leaders against European imperialism. His organization of Berber tribes in northern Morocco led to the establishment of the Rif Republic, an independent state that existed from 1921 to 1926. The Republic delivered a shocking blow to Spain when Rif forces massacred Spanish troops at the Battle of Anual in 1921. Demonstrating that indigenous forces could defeat modern European armies. This victory sent shockwaves through colonial administrations across Africa. The French and Spanish response revealed the true face of colonial rule. They deployed a combined force of 200,000 soldiers against the Rif Republic, a massive military commitment that showed how seriously European powers viewed indigenous resistance. Similar patterns emerged with the Zion Confederation of Berber tribes, which employed effective guerrilla warfare tactics against French forces, even receiving support from Germany and Austria-Hungary during World War I. In Vietnam, resistance took a decisive turn on February 10, 1930, when Vietnamese soldiers serving in the French colonial army staged the Yen Bai Mutiny. Sponsored by the Vietnam Quoc Don Dang, VNQDD, this uprising marked a critical shift from clandestine resistance to open military action. The mutiny aimed to spark a wider rebellion among the general population, revealing the growing nationalist sentiments that would eventually lead to full-scale war against French rule. Algeria's resistance continued despite decades of brutal French conquest. Small-scale attacks on French military outposts and colonial infrastructure became increasingly common, foreshadowing the larger conflict that would erupt in 1954. The French response typically involved overwhelming military force, a strategy that temporarily suppressed uprisings but only deepened anti-colonial resentment. In Madagascar, the Minalamba uprising of 1904 to 1905 combined anti-colonial sentiment with traditional religious beliefs. French authorities responded with massive military operations that devastated local populations, creating martyrs and stories of resistance that would be passed down through generations. What made these resistance movements particularly threatening to colonial authorities was their ability to adapt. When armed rebellion proved costly, resistance transformed into political and intellectual movements. The interwar period saw the emergence of educated elites in urban areas who organized political parties, published newspapers, and articulated demands for reform and self-determination. French colonial officials found themselves facing a paradox of their own making. Their mission civilisatrice, civilizing mission, had created a class of educated colonial subjects who now used French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity to challenge colonial rule itself. These intellectual leaders studied France's own revolutionary history and used it to highlight the hypocrisy of French colonial domination. This transformation of resistance from armed rebellion to political organization was occurring simultaneously across the French Empire. In Vietnam, Algeria, and Senegal, future revolutionary leaders were developing political movements that would eventually tear apart the colonial system. What France failed to recognize was that military victories over armed rebellions did not translate into political victory over the aspiration for self-determination. As political movements gained momentum across French colonies, the distant thunder of European artillery suddenly transformed colonial subjects from resistance fighters into conscripted soldiers. When World War I erupted in 1914, France faced a military crisis that would force it to rely heavily on its vast empire. The scale of colonial mobilization was unprecedented. Approximately 600,000 colonial troops were ultimately drawn into Europe's bloodbath, including 275,000 North Africans, 190,000 West Africans, and tens of thousands from Indochina, Madagascar, and other territories. These colonial soldiers, particularly the tirailleurs Senegalese from West Africa, found themselves thrust into the most nightmarish conditions of modern warfare. French military planners deliberately deployed them as shock troops in the most dangerous frontline positions at battles like Verdun and the Somme, where they endured casualty rates exceeding 25%. Despite their sacrifice, these soldiers remained second-class participants in a war supposedly fought for liberty and civilization. The military mobilization extended beyond the battlefield. Over 220,000 colonial workers were transported to France to replace French laborers who had been sent to the front. These men toiled in factories, mines, and dockyards, creating an unprecedented migration flow from colonies to metropolitan France. For many, this was their first exposure to the mother country they had been taught to revere, an experience that often revealed the contradiction between France's lofty ideals and the reality of racial prejudice. Even as colonial subjects were dying on European battlefields, French authorities worked to maintain the illusion of imperial unity and purpose. In 1916, Paris hosted a colonial exhibition designed to showcase colonial contributions to the war effort. The exhibition presented a carefully crafted narrative of imperial solidarity, while simultaneously reinforcing racial hierarchies through its portrayal of colonial peoples as exotic, primitive, and dependent on French guidance. The war transformed colonial territories themselves into battlegrounds. In Africa, Allied forces, including colonial troops, fought to capture German colonies like Cameroon and Togo. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war and declaration of jihad created complex challenges for French authorities in Muslim North Africa, who feared religious solidarity might undermine military recruitment. This forced France to implement elaborate policies that maintained control while continuing to extract manpower from these territories. For colonial subjects who survived the conflict, the war experience created a profound paradox. Men who had witnessed Europeans slaughtering each other in unprecedented numbers could no longer accept myths of Western superiority. Those who had fought alongside French soldiers expected recognition and rights commensurate with their sacrifice. Instead, they returned to colonies where discrimination remained entrenched and their contributions were quickly forgotten. The paradox extended to France itself. While celebrations emphasized the imperial family fighting together, colonial veterans returned with heightened expectations that France either couldn't or wouldn't fulfill. This disconnect planted seeds that would later blossom into independence movements across the empire. The very men who had fought to preserve the French Empire had, through their exposure to European ideals and European weaknesses, begun to envision a world beyond colonial rule. Those seeds of discontent, watered by the blood of colonial soldiers on European battlefields, erupted into organized resistance movements across the French Empire. While the 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition showcased imperial glory to 8 million visitors, behind the romanticized displays lurked a growing storm of nationalist movements that would eventually tear the empire apart. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 became a pivotal moment in colonial history. Delegations from Vietnam, Algeria, and other territories arrived in Versailles with petitions for greater rights or independence, inspired by President Wilson's principles of self-determination. Their hopes were quickly dashed as France, far from loosening its grip, tightened control over its colonial possessions in the aftermath of the war. In Algeria, the formation of the Étoile Nord-Africaine in 1926 marked a watershed moment. Founded by Algerian workers in France, this organization boldly demanded complete independence, decades before the eventual Algerian War. The movement gained traction partly because of France's broken promises to veterans who had fought for the motherland, only to return home to continue discrimination. Vietnam saw similar developments with the emergence of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, VNQDD, in 1927. This revolutionary organization led the Yen Bai Mutiny of 1930, challenging French authority before being brutally suppressed. That same year, a young revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh founded the Indochinese Communist Party, representing a new phase of resistance that combined nationalist aspirations with Marxist ideology and international support. Economic hardship during the Great Depression further fueled colonial unrest. As unemployment rose and living conditions deteriorated, resources continued flowing from colonies to France. This economic exploitation became increasingly difficult to justify, especially as educated colonial subjects pointed out the contradiction between French Republican ideals and colonial practices. France made tentative gestures toward reform, particularly during the Popular Front government 1936 to 1938. The Blum-Violet proposal sought to extend French citizenship to a select group of educated Algerians. However, its failure to pass the French Parliament only reinforced revolutionary sentiments. The message was clear: meaningful change would not come through peaceful reform. This lesson was brutally reinforced in Tunisia during 1937 to 1938, when French authorities killed 122 activists demanding constitutional reforms. The massacres demonstrated the limits of peaceful protest and the colonial system's resistance to meaningful change, pushing more activists toward revolutionary methods. Even as resistance intensified, France attempted to maintain the illusion of imperial harmony. The 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition welcomed over 8 million visitors, with elaborate pavilions showcasing romanticized versions of colonial cultures. Behind these facades, colonial subjects were categorized, studied, and displayed like exotic specimens, reinforcing racial hierarchies while masking growing unrest. As the decade ended, the contradictions of France's colonial project became increasingly apparent. The empire preached liberty while denying freedom, promised equality while enforcing racial hierarchies, and claimed brotherhood while meeting demands for rights with violence. These contradictions would become impossible to maintain after the Second World War, but their seeds were firmly planted in the interwar years. The collapse of France in May to June 1940 shattered the illusion of European invincibility across its colonial empire. As German tanks rolled through Paris, the French colonial system, built on the mythology of French military superiority, faced an existential crisis. How could colonial subjects continue to respect and fear a power that had surrendered in just 6 weeks? This question reverberated from the markets of Dakar to the rice paddies of Vietnam, fundamentally altering the relationship between France and its overseas territories. France's empire immediately fractured between competing loyalties. While the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain maintained control over much of North and West Africa, Indochina and Madagascar, General Charles de Gaulle established his Free French headquarters in London, declaring that France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. The colonial chess game began when Free French forces launched operations to seize strategic territories like Cameroon, French Equatorial Africa, and Syria from Vichy control. Japan's expansion in Asia created additional complications for French colonial authorities. In Indochina, the French colonial administration was forced into a humiliating arrangement, maintaining day-to-day control while Japanese military forces occupied key positions and commandeered resources. This arrangement lasted until March 9, 1945, when Japan executed a lightning coup, disarming French garrisons and imprisoning colonial officials. This power vacuum created the perfect opportunity for Vietnamese nationalists under Ho Chi Minh to organize and prepare for independence. The strategic importance of North Africa led to Operation Torch in November 1942, when Anglo-American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. The landings triggered complex reactions among colonial officials and local populations, with some Vichy forces resisting before switching allegiance to the Allies. For many North Africans, seeing powerful American forces arrive while France remained occupied reinforced growing doubts about French claims of superiority. Colonial soldiers became essential to France's military resurrection. When de Gaulle needed to rebuild French forces after the Metropolitan Army's collapse, he turned to the empire. The Free French Army that eventually helped liberate Europe was largely composed of African soldiers. At Monte Cassino in Italy, North African and West African troops fought with distinction in some of the war's most brutal mountain combat. During the liberation of Paris in August 1944, colonial soldiers made approximately 65% of the French 2nd Armored Division that entered the city first, though many were quickly removed from the victory parade to present a wider image of French liberation. While France celebrated victory in 1945, colonial subjects expected recognition and reward for their sacrifices. De Gaulle had convened the Brazzaville Conference in 1944, where limited reforms were proposed for French Africa, but independence remained explicitly off the table. The message was clear: France intended to maintain its empire while offering only minimal concessions. This disconnect between expectations and reality fueled anti-colonial movements. In Madagascar, growing nationalist sentiment erupted into open rebellion in March 1947. Anti-colonial fighters launched coordinated attacks against French military installations in European settlements. France's response was ruthless, sending reinforcements that used torture, summary executions, and forced resettlement. When the uprising was finally suppressed in 1948, between 30,000 and 80,000 Malagasy people had perished. As France's colonial troubles mounted in Africa, its once prized possession in Indochina was slipping through its fingers. The battle that would ultimately break France's imperial spine wasn't fought in the deserts of North Africa or the jungles of Madagascar, but in a remote valley in Vietnam that most French citizens couldn't even locate on a map. World War II had fundamentally altered the colonial equation. When Japan surrendered in 1945, a power vacuum opened in Southeast Asia. Ho Chi Minh seized this moment to declare Vietnam's independence, reading a declaration directly inspired by America's own founding document. France, however, was determined to reassert control over what it considered a jewel of its empire, despite the clear warning signs that the colonial era was ending. The conflict that erupted in 1946 highlighted a profound military mismatch. France deployed modern weaponry, aircraft, and professional soldiers, many of whom had just finished fighting against Nazi Germany. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, started with a ragtag collection of obsolete weapons and improvised explosives. What the Vietnamese lacked in military hardware, however, they compensated for with superior knowledge of the terrain and overwhelming popular support. The war quickly settled into a devastating pattern. French forces controlled urban centers and major highways during the day, while Viet Minh fighters ruled the countryside in the night. Vietnamese guerrillas mastered the art of ambush, striking isolated French outposts before melting back into the jungle or nearby villages. French military planners gravely miscalculated the conflict's nature. They prepared for a conventional war while facing what was essentially a people's revolution. By 1950, the Cold War had transformed the struggle, with Communist China providing crucial weapons and training to the Viet Minh after Mao Zedong's victory. Soviet advisors offered strategic guidance, turning a local independence movement into an international confrontation. The human cost mounted relentlessly. Colonial troops, including those from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Senegal, bore the brunt of the fighting. These soldiers, fighting to maintain a colonial system that also subjugated their own homelands, faced a particular moral quandary. Meanwhile, Vietnamese civilians endured bombings, forced relocations, and food shortages as the war devastated their homeland. By 1953, French public opinion had soured on what increasingly appeared to be an unwinnable war. The military leadership made a fateful decision, establishing a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, near the Laotian border, to draw Viet Minh forces into a conventional battle where superior French firepower could prevail. It proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the brilliant military strategist who led Viet Minh forces, surrounded the French position with artillery pieces that French intelligence believed couldn't possibly be transported through the mountainous jungle. More than 10,000 Vietnamese porters had manually hauled these heavy guns, piece by piece, across seemingly impassable terrain, assembling them in positions overlooking the French camp. When the assault began in March 1954, the outcome was virtually certain. For 56 days, Vietnamese forces pounded the French position, gradually overrunning defensive positions while cutting off air resupply. On May 7th, the garrison surrendered, with over 10,000 French soldiers marching into captivity. The psychological impact of the defeat reverberated far beyond Vietnam. A European colonial power had been decisively beaten by an Asian independence movement, a result previously considered impossible by Western military planners. The Geneva Conference that followed partitioned Vietnam temporarily as the 17th parallel, with elections scheduled to reunify the country in 1956. The same year that France surrendered at Dien Bien Phu, a new colonial crisis erupted across the Mediterranean. On November 1, 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched coordinated attacks across Algeria, marking the beginning of what would become France's most traumatic decolonization struggle. Unlike Vietnam, Algeria represented something fundamentally different in the French colonial mindset. After 132 years of French rule, Algeria wasn't considered a mere colony, but an integral part of France itself, divided into 3 French departments and represented in the National Assembly. What made Algeria unique was its complex demographic reality. Over 1 million European settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, had built lives there over generations. Many families had lived in Algeria for decades, viewing it as their rightful home. This deep-rooted European presence created a situation unlike any other in France's crumbling empire. The French government's determination to keep Algeria French stemmed not just from strategic or economic considerations, but from the political impossibility of abandoning these French citizens. The conflict rapidly escalated into extraordinary brutality on both sides. The FLN employed guerrilla tactics, bombing cafes and public spaces frequented by Europeans, while targeting Muslim Algerians they viewed as collaborators. The French military response was equally harsh, deploying massive force and controversial counterinsurgency techniques. Between 1954 and 1962, approximately 300,000 Algerians and 25,000 French died in the fighting, though exact figures remain disputed. The Battle of Algiers in 1956 to 1957 epitomized the conflict's intensity. When the FLN launched a bombing campaign in Algiers' European quarter, French authorities granted extraordinary powers to the 10th Parachute Division under General Jacques Massu. They systematically sealed off the Kasbah, the city's Muslim quarter, using checkpoints, identity papers, and house-to-house searches to dismantle the FLN network. This brutal urban counterinsurgency campaign included widespread torture, disappearances, and summary executions. Though militarily successful, the methods used created lasting trauma and damaged France's international reputation. By 1958, the Algerian conflict had destabilized France itself. The Fourth Republic collapsed amid fears of military coup, bringing World War II hero Charles de Gaulle back to power. Initially ambiguous about his intentions, de Gaulle promised to keep French Algeria, while beginning to recognize the inevitability of Algerian self-determination. This realization put him on a collision course with the Pieds Noirs and elements of the military who had championed his return. The war's brutality only intensified. The French constructed electrified border barriers along the Tunisian and Moroccan frontiers to prevent FLN fighters from seeking sanctuary. Meanwhile, the military relocated over 2 million rural Algerians into regroupment centers to separate them from insurgents, creating miserable conditions that further alienated the population. The French deployed over 400,000 troops at the conflict's peak, more than they had used in Indochina. By 1961, international pressure mounted against France. The newly independent African nations supported Algeria at the United Nations, while Cold War rivals exploited France's colonial struggles. More importantly, domestic French opinion had shifted. Conscripted soldiers returned with disturbing accounts of the war. Intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre denounced French actions, and public protests grew. In April 1961, 4 retired generals attempted a military coup in Algiers, which de Gaulle put down through a televised appeal to the nation. With Algeria's independence, France's centuries-long empire came to an end. Though remnants of its overseas territories remained, the dream of a global French empire was over. The same nation that had once ruled vast stretches of North America, Africa, the Caribbean, and Indochina now found itself redefining its role on the world stage. In a bitter irony, many of the independence movements France had crushed were inspired by the very ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that had shaped France's own revolution. In the years that followed, France pivoted from empire to soft power, maintaining influence through cultural, economic, and military ties with its former colonies. But the age of French colonial rule, the age of conquest, expansion, and control, was finished. France's journey from a medieval kingdom to a global empire and ultimately to a modern republic has been one of ambition, conflict, and reinvention. Its influence, once spread across continents, now endures through culture, diplomacy, and legacy. If you found this story fascinating, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history.